significant impacts on the environment. They tend to have huge resources in terms of what they have, but also in terms of their demand. And obviously the impact on emissions and then global warming is, well, it's quite a lot, it's quite stark. Global and regional alliances, are they more effective than IGOs in reducing emissions? That's an important question to ask. The EU, for instance, has done a lot of work on reducing emissions, more so than most other IGOs. But then we've also got the IPCC in there as well. But then there's also the question of how much does the world listen to the IPCC, and how much are they going to act upon the recommendations of the IPCC. Now, there's a really interesting and useful website. It's called ArcGIS, and it shows a whole number of different maps which highlight different emissions, different greenhouse gases, and different things that go on environmentally around the world. They're really good to analyse. So see if you can register on the website and have a play around with it. The instructions are right there. Okay. What I want you ultimately to do is to describe and explain what you can see on the maps. A bunch of P paragraphs. Sort of maps that you'll be looking at, for instance, are this one. Total CO2 emissions. Obviously, the two things that really jump out there are China and the USA. Another one there, in terms of total CO2 emissions. Total CO2 emissions with a difference from 1990 to 2012. Okay, so the triangle is 2012, the circle is 1990. So in terms of growth, that's what we're looking at there. We can really see how economic growth and development, particularly the BRICS, increases the amount of emissions. Now, emissions per capita. This is quite an interesting one, because obviously once we then get to China, emissions per person are relatively low. And we can see different patterns there. The Middle East, for me, jumps out there in terms of emissions per person. Why do you think that is? Right? So make a couple of points, give some explanations, P paragraphs to try and explain these patterns. Fossil fuel consumption. This is quite an interesting one. Australia, Europe, and North America, way ahead in terms of the consumption of fossil fuels. China, surprisingly, not there. So just think about in your notes the key things that has led to the increase in the emissions. What are the factors? Why have there been different rates? So compare different countries there. What are the results of these changes? And why are certain nations not so willing to cut down on their emissions? And this feeds into what I want you to do towards the end of this. Okay, so some key maps there that show changes over time, 84, 99 and 2010. China, there's a picture taken in Shanghai, and that is not fog, that's not mist, that is pollution. And that guy running in it is probably not doing his lungs any good whatsoever. Also though, of course, world trade, containerization, more things being moved around the world, increase in emissions. Linked, of course, also to deforestation. There's less in the world to suck up all that excess carbon dioxide. Now, little clip there about Leonardo DiCaprio. Everyone loves Leonardo DiCaprio. Little interview about emissions in India. And I just want you to have a watch of that and think, whose responsibility is it to reduce emissions? And think, is it reasonable for countries to resist global initiatives in favour of their own industrial and financial development? So India, for instance, still has huge levels of poverty. The only way it's going to get a lot of those people out of poverty is by developing economically. But in doing so, it's going to cause a lot more greenhouse gases. So is that a reasonable thing for them to be able to do. Of course, since 2016, since Donald Trump became president, he is quite famously not a believer in the concept of global warming. Okay, so therein lies a bit of a problem. So what are China, the USA and the EU and Russia trying to do to reduce emissions? I mean, for the US, very little at the moment. They're investing a lot more in their coal industry, they're investing a lot more in fossil fuels, and they're taking money out of renewable energies. So, we're going to have what would have been sort of a little class debate, but unfortunately we don't have time for it. So what I would like you to do, 2 tables, arguments for, arguments against, and the key thing that I want you to argue for and against is it's this question here. Okay, is it reasonable for countries to resist global initiatives in favour of their own industrial and financial development? Okay, so whose responsibility is it? Is it high-income countries? Is it their responsibility to deal with global emissions? Or is it for the BRICS, the developing countries? Do they need to develop affordable public transport as an alternative to cars, for instance? Do they need to invest more in renewable technologies? Whose role is it? And then that feeds in quite nicely to a 20-mark question, which is on